Good afternoon. We're live from the Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the LSU Center for River Studies. Excited to kick off Coastal Week, a series of presentations that will be building to Coastal Day Monday next week. So Monday, March the 30th is officially Coastal Day. We've got a list of activities that will start out right here from 8 to 11 o'clock. A Coastal Connect, a business-to-business opportunity for businesses to engage with each other. At 1 o'clock, we'll move downtown to the Capitol, to the governor's press room for an event with a number of speakers that will be part of that. At 2 o'clock, there'll be outreach to legislators down in Memorial Hall, the first floor of the Capitol. At 2:30, the events will move to the Galvez building, the Oliver Pollock room. There'll be an open house for Deepwater Horizon projects and programs for folks to engage with the folks who are leading those efforts for a number of different organizations. From 3 to 5 o'clock, CPRA will have a forecast of projects that we anticipate going to bid or looking for services in the next 18 months or so. That'll be at the LaSalle building in the LaBelle room, 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock. At 5 o'clock, folks will move over to the Pentagon for a crawfish boil, where folks can get together and break bread and engage and kind of celebrate the events of the day. The next day, so the fun doesn't stop on the 30th. On the 31st, we have partner-led projects. So in coastal Louisiana, we've got parishes and levee districts and NGOs and federal agencies who have projects that will be going to bid for the next 18 months, and this will review that. That's going to be virtual only. If you'll go to the next slide. So just to reiterate, from 2:30 to 4, that'll be the Louisiana Trustee Implementation Group, sometimes referred to as the TIG in Louisiana. They oversee work that's as part of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill mitigation efforts. This will be their annual meeting. It will serve as their annual meeting. It'll be live and in person, again, at the Galvez building, Oliver Pollock room. It won't just be folks from the TIG. We'll also have representatives from the Restore Council and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Sometimes that acronym is NFWF. If you go to the next slide. So leading into next week, we've got a fantastic series of webinars. They're going to focus on one of our coastal master plan objectives, which is harnessing natural processes to restore coastal wetlands. We've got a dream team of presenters. If you go to the next slide, leading off the week, Dr. Mike Miner from the Water Institute, he's going to discuss some of those coastal processes so we have a better understanding as we're leading into the rest of the presentations the rest of the week. If you go to the next slide, Danielle Ricciardi from our New Orleans office will talk about the Davis Pond freshwater diversion project that we've had on the landscape for years, and Danielle's part of the team that monitors and operates that project for the state. Next slide. Brian Gossman, again, from our New Orleans office, is going to talk about crevasses and diversions in the Mississippi River, particularly focusing on evaluating the monitoring data. Brian is part of the team that monitors those projects, so he's going to help us understand some of the lessons learned from the implementation of those projects. Some of those projects have been on the landscape for 2 or 3 decades, and we've got good information on how those function. Next slide. We've got Byrne Wood from our Lafayette field office and Natalie Mathern from our New Orleans field office will give us some information on terraces, wetland terraces, landscaping a better coast. Terraces as a restoration tool. So how can we create landforms that capture sediment as it's moving through the system and build landforms? So beyond the terraces itself, those projects have functionality where they can actually capture sediment. So Byrne and Natalie will be giving that presentation. And then closing out our week, we've got 2 fantastic presenters, Elizabeth Gerald from our New Orleans office and Darren Lee from our Lafayette office. Elizabeth's going to be talking about hydrologic restoration, and Darren Lee is going to be talking about vegetative planting and capturing sand. So how can we harness those aeolian-driven sands on some of our barrier islands to create landforms for restoring the wetlands and making those projects more effective in the long term. If you go to the next slide, If you need information how to connect to these online, if you go to coastal.la.gov on the right side of the website, we've got our calendar that'll provide links to all of these presentations. If you would like to register for the Coastal Connect event that'll be right here on Monday starting at 8 o'clock, go to louisianactac.org. That's the Coastal Technical Assistance Center at ctac.org, and you can register online and be part of that event. It's free of cost, free of charge, 8 to 11 a.m. to be here. Go to the next slide. And just a note, we are live, and so we're taking your questions or comments. If you've got questions, comments, or insights that you'd like to share with us, you can email those to us at coastal@la.gov. We'll do our best to get to all of your questions today before 1 o'clock. But if there's too many questions that go beyond this, we'll try to email you afterwards. So with that said, I'm proud to introduce a colleague and a good friend, Dr. Mike Miner from the Water Institute. He's going to lead off this exciting week of presentations with a presentation that will talk about harnessing natural processes to restore coastal wetlands. Mike?
Thank you, Greg, and it's really an honor. Thank you, CPRA, to be leading off this series of webinars. And I will be, as Greg said, I'm from the Water Institute, and today I'm going to be talking about harnessing natural processes to restore coastal wetlands. Kind of provide a big picture of background that should help support some of the content in the talks the rest of the week. And so start off with the Coastal Master Plan 2023. And natural processes are one of the main objectives. Harnessing natural processes are one of the main objectives. You can see flood protection, coastal habitats, cultural heritage, and the working coast are also listed. And when we say natural processes and restoration in the master plan, the objective is to promote a sustainable coastal ecosystem by harnessing natural processes of the system. And there's some guiding principles, and there's a lot more than I've listed here, but the ones that I'm going to touch on today that are relevant to this objective of harnessing natural processes include long-term solutions, a systems approach, efficient use of resources, and sediment for restoration. And sediment is one of those resources that's very limited. In fact, the master plan points out that the main constraints of implementation of everything in the master plan is funding and sediment. So what are natural processes? Today we're going to talk about deltaic and coastal processes and break that down to physical processes and biological processes. So when we talk about physical processes, mostly it's sediment erosion, transportation, and deposition by water or wind. And this includes fluvial or river processes, deltaic processes, coastal and estuarine processes, estuarine circulation, waves, nearshore currents, and storms, and relative sea level change. And you can see on this plot here, this is from the NOAA Grand Isle tide gauge, and it shows a record of sea level change dating back to 1948, and the rate that we get there for relative sea level rise, which includes the subsidence, the sinking of the land, and eustatic sea level rise, global sea level rise, is a little over 9 millimeters per year over this historical record. So close to a centimeter per year, which is much faster than most of the world, and especially the rest of the Gulf and Atlantic coast of the U.S. And then the biological processes, ones that are important to this deltaic evolution, really involves vegetative productivity. So these wetland vegetation, it can help keep up with this relative sea level rise. So we're sinking, and sea level is rising globally, but the vegetation in the marsh can build up upon itself in a process we call vertical accretion. So it can, at some point it might not be able to keep up at some rates, but as it keeps up, it traps sediment, and so it basically builds its own foundation through time as sea level rises. So this concept, we have all these processes that are at play here, and our deltaic coast is an open system, so we have inputs from the river, sediment and water, and we have outputs that we lose to offshore sediment. And so understanding these processes and what drives them, how they interact, are really important to develop these restoration strategies. And to make optimal use of limited sediment, remember this is one of the limiting factors in implementing the master plan. It has to be at low cost. And so we utilize the power of flowing waters to move sediment to create and maintain wetlands and barrier islands and maximize how much we retain, how much sediment we can retain in the system. So that's kind of going to be the theme of the talk today. And Greg mentioned terraces, and I'll talk more about them, but there's an image there from the BS11 Fort St. Philip terraces. So to understand these processes, really what we're managing here is the delta cycle. And so delta cycle has two phases: a constructive phase where the river is building out into the open body of water, building land, and so we get growth of deltas into bays, into the Gulf, and then at some point that becomes inefficient. So it builds out so much it loses energy, and the river can find a shorter course to the open water. And usually that shorter course means it has a steeper gradient, so the water flows faster, so it'll capture the flow of the river and build a new delta while it abandons the old delta. And that abandonment right here, as you see on the plot, results in erosion of that delta that was built by waves, beaches, by waves and storms. And so basically the river has cut off supply to that old delta, and you can see here this new cycle is starting at some other location in the delta plain where a new delta is being built by the river. These are some graphics that we came up with a few years ago working on the presentation and the video that's here at the River Center. Worked with CPRA, Tilt, Emergent Method, and NIFWF. And so this is just kind of a graphical representation of how the delta plain evolved over the past 5,000 years. And so you can see the rivers building out into the Gulf, and with time we built out into what we call the Bayou Teche system. Then there was an avulsion upstream, and that Bayou Teche delta starts to erode while the St. Bernard delta complex builds out to the east, and that was followed by the Lafourche delta. So this is the Bayou Lafourche system, and you can see it building out to build the central coast, and then abandoned to form the modern Plaquemines in our Birdfoot delta that we have today. And so this cycle I just show is the delta complexes, and they persist with river dominance on the order of millennia. And so here we have the delta plain as a whole. So the delta plain is made up of multiple delta complexes, and shown here the Maringouin, Teche, Lafourche, Belize, and St. Bernard, with the time period of activity over here on the right. And so there's this hierarchy, and deltas are built out of smaller deltas that are built out of smaller deltas. So geologists and geomorphologists really like to develop classification schemes, and so this is there's not like abrupt boundaries between these, but first order, when we say from big to small, is the delta plain that I just described, the delta complexes that are active on the order of millennia, delta lobe that are active on the order of hundreds of years, and then subdelta that are usually active around a century, and then a crevasse splay. A crevasse splay is the smallest delta. It's the basic building block of deltas. So little deltas within make up big deltas. And the term crevasse, and we use that a lot today, and that term is basically a breach or a break in the natural levee of the river where flow can be captured in the landform that's built as a result. The delta is called a crevasse splay. So how does the delta build land? And it's important to understand the basics of this, and it's pretty simple. We have a river flowing into an open body of water, the receiving basin, and as the water velocity is contained within the natural levees or the levees of the river, and so as it enters an open body of water, that expands and velocity slows, and so it drops the densest sediment right there at the mouth, and we call this a distributary mouth bar. And what this does is it starts to block the flow, and so the river needs to flow around it. So in this way, we get these mouth bars that form, And then you'll have two separate distributaries that form from one, and it's called a bifurcation. And so this process builds on itself, and you can see this nice delta form that we have here. The bottom is the Wax Lake Delta, and the top is Brandt's Crevasse and Cupid's Gap down in the Bird's Foot. Another subdelta that's part of the Bird's Foot is the West Bay subdelta. So this is a place of an active delta building right now, but it had been historically. So if you can look over time, this is a time series of maps showing 1845 to 1958. And basically, you can see this site. This is the life cycle of the West Bay subdelta. And so that, remember that curve I showed about the delta cycle, and on that size, we're really talking about complexes, but the same thing applies to all scales of these different size deltas. And so you can see it was active for about 150 years. And so it eroded, and now we're building a new delta into West Bay. There's 5 major subdeltas of the Bird's Foot, and another one we just talked about, West Bay. So this other one here we're talking about in the yellow box is called the Baptiste Colette subdelta, and so that breach formed just across the river from Venice. And so you can see again in this time series here, we have this original crevasse splay, and through time, how rapidly it builds out the land, and then once it becomes inefficient at transporting sediment to the system, it starts to decay and go into that destructive phase or the transgressive phase of the delta cycle. So this process has been tapped to manage and help promote land gain or prevent land loss. Here's some examples within this Cupid's Gap subdelta. And this is Delta Wildlife, National Wildlife Refuge. And so there's some projects that have been done there by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and there's other crevasse programs, CPRA, as well as Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries on their wildlife management areas as well. And the idea here is to build a breach in the natural levee where you have an open water and to retain as much sediment as possible. And so they use a few tools besides just cutting a hole in the levee. And you can see here with these different lines on the map is where they built the terraces. And the idea here is that these terraces slow down the flow as the river channel enters into the bay. And so as it slows down the flow, it allows sediment to fall out and be deposited. And so it's a very efficient way of trapping sediment. There's another word that they use sometimes, and I'll use it, you'll see it here, for these types of terraces, and it's called a SRED, S-R-E-D, or a sediment retention enhancement device. And so here is that same area, and I'm just going to show you a time series of how quickly this and effective this land building is. And this project was built with a series with some funds that were from a settlement from a natural resources damage assessment related to an oil spill. And so the responsible party has to basically restore so many damaged resources. And the most efficient way to do that in this area is actually to just cut a hole in the levee and help it out with some of those terraces. So here's the crevasse site you can see pointed out with the yellow arrow. And you can see the crevasse there, and you can see these terraces that were constructed as part of this. This is 2015, and then here we are in 2016, and you can barely even see, this is almost 2 years later, but you can barely even see where those closest terraces were constructed and how efficient they are at trapping sediment and building land. And the thing about these crevasses is that it's not just like a one and done. They continue to nourish this area, and so they're self-sustaining over time until they do become inefficient. But also what's happening here is there's a whole system of crevasses that are being used to nourish this subdelta. And Delta Wildlife National Wildlife Refuge. And so they'll have one that's new and some that might be 10, 20 years old. And so they're always kind of have a beneficial relationship to each other and overall maintain land area. And just a few photos. These are from Barrett Forche at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And you can see this is the construction. You can see the terraces here and the planting. So they planted the terraces with native vegetation to help trap sediment and retain sediment that was placed there. And 1 year post-construction, this is a highly productive area, and so it's amazing how fast things grow down here. When you go down there once a year or so, it's like you're going to a whole different place because it's so dynamic and changes so much, mostly because of how fast the vegetation can establish. So 1 year post-construction of that same terrace, and then you can see 3 years post-construction here. It's like more diversity with floating aquatics and continued land building. So that's like one of those smaller scale crevasses as part of this larger crevasse management approach. Another one that's become world famous probably is the Neptune Pass. And so this is a newer crevasse, and it formed naturally. It's just upriver from the areas I was showing you near Buras, Louisiana. And so here you can see in 2019, this is the channel we're talking about, Neptune Pass. And 2 years later or 3 years later, how much wider it is, and carrying much more flow, almost tenfold more flow, because once it starts to capture and it's an efficient pathway, then velocity can increase and scour deeper and allow for more flow. So this one is really interesting because it's important to maintain a certain amount of flow in the main stem of the Mississippi River, because that's what flushes the shipping channel out, and so keeps us from having to dredge it too much for navigation interests. And in this case, the flow was so strong here, coming out of Neptune Pass, leaving the river, that as ships were passing by, they would have to throttle up and work hard to stay in the authorized channel, the cut channel, and make sure they didn't get pulled and grounded on the bank. And another thing that happened with this, as a result of it expanding so fast after the 2019 high river year in the Mississippi River, is that the Army Corps that maintains this Mississippi River ship channel, by dredging it pretty frequently, especially during high water, this area of the channel doesn't typically have to be dredged, and it's very rare for them to dredge north of Venice, Louisiana, on this part of the river for maintenance dredging. And they had to move a dredge up here that was working down at the mouth of the river to clear some sediment that had been deposited in the channel. And so that was it caught their attention. Typically, the way the Corps handles this is, and you can see there's all kind of flow loss along the channel here, is if something is getting out of control, they basically start to restrict it and try to close it off, usually using rock structures. And here's just a quick history of Neptune Pass's recent evolution. It was pretty stable up until 2012, 2011. We had a high water year there, and so we start to see expansion. And look at this is the volume of flow, 10,000 cubic feet per second, that's flowing through for this decade pretty much. But then after that 2019 high water event, we see it, like I said, an order of magnitude increase to 120,000 cubic feet per second. So once that happens, it starts to run away, as we would say, and starts to rapidly expand. And so there was an initial response to put some rock down to prevent erosion further at the bottom. It kept eroding and scouring out around the rock. And so the Corps' initial idea was to basically close it off. And then they decided that was going to be, could cause other problems, and I'll tell you about those in a second. So right now they're using a phased approach, which involves developing some shreds or terraces in the receiving basin to basically capture sediment and reduce flow so that they can maintain this channel with some flow and not risk having breaches upstream or downstream. So that's kind of what we're showing here. Here we have the Neptune Pass, and these two yellow lines show two of the alternatives evaluated by the Army Corps. And one was a rock structure here, which would significantly constrict the flow, and they determined that basically the flow would find a way and flank that structure and ultimately compromise it. The second one was construction of a rock dike or dam right at the pass where it meets the river, and it was determined that could risk failure due to it basically the scour, the fast-moving water undermining the rocks and then just falling into a deep hole. In fact, there happens to be a hole right here that's scoured out due to the high flow. It's over 100 feet deep. And so they also worry that it could plug it here, and you can increase flow in some of these other smaller crevasses and have the same problem. And so they came up with a strategy, like I said, that employs the shreds and trying to trap sediment in the receiving basin, which is Quarantine Bay. And so this is some modeling results that were conducted by New Orleans District Army Corps, Caitlin Keller and Brendan Ewell. And you can see here they have the shreds, the sediment retention devices. And basically what happens is the flow velocity is slowed. And so by slowing that flow velocity, you decrease the expansion of this channel in depth and width. And so, and start to build land around this area. And there's a feedback where it continues to reduce the flow as it builds this delta that is helped along by these structures such as terraces and shreds. So this is some interesting back of the envelope information here, and I mentioned that there's a large program of crevasse management in the Bird's Foot, and you can see here a lot of these are in Delta Wildlife Management Area and down here in Passalut Wildlife Management Area. And so this is some work done by a few folks that I have listed here, but Tara Yoakum, she was at UNO working with Dr. Giannis Giorgio, and compared how many acres they have been built with the dredge versus the historical crevassing program, and how much it costs per acre. And so basically, we get with the dredge, you can build 400 acres a year, and this is beneficial use of material that's dredged from the Mississippi River Ship Channel to maintain navigation. And when you build it with the dredge, though, it does do some sediment, it has some sediment trapping benefits, but for the most part, it starts to disintegrate after you place it if you don't have anything to nourish it with a continuous new sediment source like a crevasse does. So with the crevassing, basically what happens is they cut the hole in the levee and they get land emergence within 2 years and expansion for 10 years after that. And so the cost difference here for the dredge, $15,000 per acre versus the crevasse, $550 per acre. So that was a few examples of how the constructive phase of the delta cycle works. And so now we'll talk a little bit about the destructive phase. So here's a kind of a graphical cartoon image of a delta cycle, broken down into 4 phases. And this is what we call a conceptual geomorphic model, and it was conceived by Shea Penland and others back in the 80s when he was at Louisiana Geological Survey. So you have the active delta building out and prograding into the open water, in this case the Gulf, and then that delta gets abandoned for a new, more favorable delta somewhere else, and so sediment supply from the river begins to wane, and processes, coastal processes, marine processes such as waves, tides, and storms start to rework this old deltaic deposit and distribute the sand laterally out to the flanks. And so the waves have this protruding body of sediment with a high sand content, and the result is you get these flanking barrier islands as this headland erodes back. And so an example of this would be in real life would be the Caminada headland at Bayou Lafourche and flanking barrier islands of Grand Isle and Timbalier Islands. With time, we have the relative sea level rise, and then as tidal velocities increase in the back barrier, they can become more efficient at eroding the wetlands, and so we get mainland detachment of that headland, and it becomes a barrier island system. And the real world example of this is the Chandelier Islands or the Ile Dernière. And so here you get continued wave erosion in the back barrier, and so there's a feedback as the bays get bigger. The waves in the bay can be bigger. They have more distance they can travel across. And as that happens, the shorelines erode faster and faster. Also, because the sand source is limited, it was supplied there by the delta. At some point, it can't keep up with the relative sea level rise either, and sand is constantly being shed to the flanks. And so we get what's called transgressive submergence or barrier island submergence, and convert it to a shoal that's on the shelf, on the continental shelf. And an example of this would be Ship Shoal offshore of the modern Ile Dernière. And so this is the kind of the large-scale process of delta evolution and disintegration that we consider when we're managing the transgressive phase or the destructive phase, which comprises most of our coast. So here's an example about how we use this understanding of the natural processes of barrier island evolution and deltaic disintegration to manage the coast. A lot of this information comes from CPRA's Barrier Island Comprehensive Monitoring Program, which is constantly trying to track sediment and shoreline evolution along the coast and understand what's driving the barrier island erosion. So this example here, is Caminada headland restoration, and also upcoming, there's a new project at West Belle Pass, right here, just west of Port Fouchon, to restore the headland there, and they use Ship Shoal sand. So this was a big game changer. This sand used to be part of a barrier island that was submerged probably a few thousand years ago. And we know that it is high quality sand, and because it used to be a barrier island shoreline. And so that sand was mined at Ship Shoal and transported 20 to 30 miles to build the beaches in dunes at Caminada Headland. And at the same time, dunes were constructed and vegetated with vegetative plantings to help promote dune growth and stabilize the sand that was placed there. So it's kind of like turning back the clock. So we basically went from that phase 3 submerged shoal on the shelf and are bringing the sand back into the system, importing it into this modern coastal system to help offset that deficit in the sand budget. Another example of how we do this is at the Chandelier Islands. There's a project that's in design right now. Hopefully it's going to construction this year, led by CPRA. And the Chandelier Islands are rapidly eroding and on that path to converting to an inner shelf shoal. And there was some work we did after Katrina that predicted if we kept getting storm frequency like we were having during that time period, with a high frequency period that had Gustav, Ike, Katrina, Rita, that the islands wouldn't really persist past 2013. But luckily, things slowed down as far as storm frequency and intensity. And so that prediction was that these islands would be converted to a shoal by 2037. And I see I have this red diamond there that's kind of plotting where they are today. So, and you can see the shoreline change that goes from 1850s to 2021 here. And you can see there's some recovery, but it's still trending towards converting to a shoal. Some of the same work we were doing after Katrina was looking at, as part of the Barrier Island Comprehensive Monitoring Program, looking at seafloor change, not just shoreline change. And what we can do is compared surveys that were done in the 1870s, in this case to 2007. And so you compare the surveys, and you can see how the seafloor changes, and that's a proxy for erosion or deposition of the seafloor. So where you see these bluish purple colors, that's deposition over that time period, and where you see the hotter colors, that's erosion. So you can see the front side or shore face is eroding, and sediments being transported up to the flanks, or out to the flanks, some in the back barrier. For a barrier island to maintain exposure, you basically want a balance of how much is eroded on the front to how much is deposited in the back. And what we see here is a large volume being lost, almost 1 million cubic yards per year up to here to Hughes Point. And this is lost to a deep water location where it doesn't make it back into the island system by natural processes. So kind of zooming in a little bit on how this area evolved, and we had the 4-stage model, but here's a few more stages. And so you have this delta building out, rivers dominating it, the river abandons this delta, and so waves start to rework the sands and form these recurve spits here. And with time, these spits build out and recurve into the back, and then there's enough sand being supplied by waves eroding that original deltaic depot center and being transported out, forming these recurve spits. So these are thick deposits of sand that are deposited in relatively deep water. And you can see here where I have B pointing out at those relic spits. They become vegetated with marsh and dune vegetation. And with time, the shoreline erodes from the Gulf side, and it starts basically eating into these back barrier deposits, these former spit deposits. So the sand gets recycled again. It gets eroded at the shore face on the Gulf side here, and you can see here we have the barrier sands over the marshes. The barriers are migrating over these marshes, and these are those old spit or inlet fill sands, very thick, clean sands. And so as the island erodes, and this happens at depth too, not just at the shoreline, at depths to 25 feet or more, that sand gets eroded and re-injected into the system. So in this way, the islands can be self-nourishing. But remember, the system is losing a lot of this material to the flanks that is being lost from the system. But this is part of what informs this restoration strategy, and talking about embracing the natural processes and working with nature. So here's I wrote like picking up where we left off along the path to submergence. The islands where we are today are about in this 3 to 4 area. So we have lost a lot of the southern part of the island chain, and the restoration project is focusing on trying to restore and maintain this northern part of the Chandelier Islands. What we've learned is once they become submerged and there's no more back barrier marshes left, they start to behave a lot differently. Instead of thinning in place and eroding from the front side, the whole sand body starts to migrate like a tank tread, and so it never becomes stable enough to really form a robust barrier island system and back barrier marsh. And so that's where a threshold crossing that we're trying to intervene with when we do these restoration projects. So here's the overall concept. This is not an engineering drawing. This is something we can get some coastal scientists put together based on what we've learned over a few decades studying Chandelier Islands. And so the idea is we have this large sand body that's being deposited about 1 million cubic yards a year in the north, and we have this eroding central portion. And the arc shape tells you a lot about what's going on with the waves and where the sediment is transported. And so you can see the dominant longshore transport directions here to the north and south. And this is kind of what we call the node, where there's either bidirectional transport, or most of it's going south or most of it's going north. And so the idea is to take this sediment, dredge it, and place it in the central portion of the island so that it can then nourish the islands over a long period of time. And also, remember we talked about those spits that are now these back barrier marsh protrusions that you see here along the island. And basically extending those further into the back barrier with thick sand so that as the island erodes, it will eat into those and basically inject new sand into the system over time. And so this part of the design and understanding how these islands naturally evolved and formed in the first place and incorporating that into the restoration adds decades to the lifespan of this project based on some predictive model forecasts. All right, and one more topic that's really, when we talk about systems approaches and the destructive phase, the interior wetlands, like these bays and estuarine systems, are closely linked to the barrier island systems. And so there's as the wetlands erode, the bays get larger and larger. And so that increases the volume of water that is going to be passing through these barrier island inlets, these passes, every day during each tidal cycle. And so here, as these inlets need to accommodate more water from a larger bay, they have to deepen and widen. And what happens is the islands get smaller and they lose sand. Sand gets lost offshore. And so with time, as the bays expand, the islands erode more because of how much bay area there is. And so one thing that was a study that was done in the North Sea and the Frisian Islands in 1984 by Duncan Fitzgerald and some other folks that were at Louisiana Geological Survey, they looked at this area in the North Sea where there was poldering, and so land was reclaimed from the 1650s until the 1800s. It filled up much of the bay. And so here are these passes that I talked about between the islands, and this plot is showing the barrier island length increases as the drainage area or the size of the bay decreases. So by filling in the bay, they actually enhance the barrier islands without ever putting any sound mechanically. So the islands grew as a result of the bay shrinking. And so that concept is being applied here in Louisiana, and it's a component of the master plan with the interior with marsh restoration projects. And it's probably small, but here's the 2023 Coastal Master Plan projects map. And one of the approaches that's focused on managing the tidal prism or trying to prevent too much bay expansion is the creation of land bridges. And so these are done using dredges to build marsh and ridges. And you can see they built perpendicular to the axis of these bay systems, and so it prevents expansion of the tidal prism north of there. Right now, if you have a tidal range, the vertical distance between high and low tide during the average tidal cycle in Barataria Bay is about 1.5 feet. And just north of it, where you have these broken marshes and these smaller marsh ponds, the tidal range is about 0.5 foot. And so that land that's rapidly eroding provides significant friction, just like we talked about with the shreds, and keeps water from every day during the tidal cycle from moving in and out as rapidly. So filling in the space of the open bay here and building these land bridges is actually very beneficial to the barrier islands and keeps them from being breached and those inlets widening and deepening and losing sand offshore. All right, so had two slides of conclusions, and I looked at it this morning and I decided I can do it in one statement. So to sum it up, a resilient coast requires that we understand, quantify, and work with the natural processes that govern coastal and deltaic evolution. And when I say understand, we have decades of research to inform this that's being applied to the projects in the Coastal Master Plan, and quantify, we continue to quantify through monitoring programs like the Barrier Island Comprehensive Monitoring Program and CRIMS and the swamp program that CPRA has implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for the presentation. If we've got questions or comments that anyone has, you can send those in to coastal@la.gov, and we'll be glad to try to answer them. We've got one right now. Mike, you talked a little bit about longshore transport of sediment, particularly relative to barrier islands. How do you go about kind of assessing longshore transport, or how is that done in practice?
So longshore transport is basically, as it implies, is a longshore transport of sediment by waves and wave-driven currents. And so there's a few different ways. It's hard to measure directly. There's some ways that to predict it, and it's based on dominant wind direction and dominant wave height. And so if you know the angle that the waves are hitting the beach, you can predict, in the size of the waves, you can predict the potential for how much sediment will be moved. But then again, you have to have the sediment in the system to be moving. In other ways that are proxies or ways we can infer sediment transport, like I mentioned before, the way we can do these two measurements, these two surveys in two different time periods, compare them and see where we're getting erosion and deposition. And also there's some ways when we look at these recurve spits that I mentioned, like these in this cartoon, as they build out and recurve, we can infer sediment transport directions and help us quantify how much sand is being moved by waves along shore.
Excellent. We've got one other question, wanting to know about understanding where remnant channels were of deltas or subdeltas within a basin, where even in an area where the land has been eroded, how does understanding where those channels, is there any benefit to understanding where those channels were?
Yeah, understanding where the relic channels were and that form the delta, and ultimately these barrier islands is important for various reasons. One is that they have a higher sand content, so the deposit, the geologic deposit, has higher sand content, and will subside a little slower and compact a little slower. The other one is, as they erode, that sand gets reintroduced into the system. So, as I mentioned, like here, where you see this relic channel coming out, it was the source of sand for the barrier islands as they naturally evolved. There's a lot of other reasons we want to know that too, and understanding the delta hydrology and how we might help mimic that in the restoration program, and understand how river water might flow through the ground through the higher sand content material. It's more porous and permeable. As the river rises, there could be some groundwater flow into the basin through those sandier channels.
Like an ancient relic river that's kind of still alive.
Yeah, if you get enough pressure by like a high river, then there's a head, it can push it through.
Excellent, fantastic. Well, Mike, thank you very much for the presentation. Appreciate you batting leadoff for Coastal Week. Want to invite everybody who's watching, come back the rest of this week. Tomorrow we'll have Danielle Ricciardi from our New Orleans field office will be giving a presentation. Then all the way through Friday, we'll have presentations at the noontime hour. And then take a look at the schedule for next week. Register for the Coastal Connects that'll be here at the Center for River Studies at LSU, or take a look at all the other meetings and exciting opportunities that'll be happening Monday, March 30th, and carrying over into Tuesday, March 31st. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow. Have a great day.